Hey, Eagles Nation! Tonight, the Eagles are back on the field. And after everything we've seen this week in Foxborough, this game is much more than just another preseason game. Philadelphia and New England have already gone through 2 intense days of joint practices, and now they will have the opportunity to settle this on the field under the lights of Gillette Stadium. The Eagles are looking for something very specific tonight: evolution, consistency, and answers from the players who are fighting to secure their place on this roster. And that's exactly what makes this game so interesting. Even without some of the main starters playing for very long, there are players who have everything to gain and potentially everything to lose. Will Nick Sirianni change the strategy after the latest loss against the Ravens? Now, without much delay, let's get to the video because the Philadelphia Eagles are facing some extremely difficult roster decisions, and after one preseason game and a week of joint practices with the New England Patriots, several players are starting to separate themselves from the competition. The biggest question is no longer simply who has talent. It is about who has done enough to earn one of those precious 53 roster spots. And in several position groups, the Eagles may have more legitimate options than available places. At quarterback, one of the most interesting battles is developing behind Jalen Hurts. The projection from the source has Tanner McKee making the roster while veteran Andy Dalton does not. That is a significant decision because Dalton has been working as the backup behind Hurts throughout the spring and summer. But McKee has something that could ultimately change the equation: more upside. The key could be what happens during the final 2 preseason games. If McKee gets the opportunity and continues to outplay Dalton, the Eagles could decide that the younger quarterback is the better option moving forward. That would also create another possibility for Dalton. Because of his experience, he could potentially become attractive to another team looking for a veteran quarterback, either as a spot starter or as an experienced player who can help develop a younger quarterback. But Philadelphia also has another intriguing player in Cole Payton, and this is where the roster decision becomes even more interesting. The projection has Hurts, McKee, and Payton as the 3 quarterbacks on the 53-man roster. The reasoning is that this Eagles roster is too deep at too many other positions to justify carrying 4 quarterbacks. And there is also the question of whether Payton would even make it through waivers. After what he showed against Baltimore, there is a belief that another team could become interested in his developmental potential. Payton is described as a very intriguing developmental player at the most important position in football, and there is even the possibility of using him in a Taysom Hill-like role if he is active on game days. That makes the quarterback situation one of the first major roster battles Eagles fans need to watch closely. At running back, the projection becomes much simpler, with Philadelphia keeping 3 players: Saquon Barkley, Tank Bigsby, and Will Shipley. But even here, there is one major issue that could force the Eagles to reconsider the plan. Bigsby is dealing with a toe injury, and if that injury turns out to be turf toe and keeps him sidelined for an extended period, the Eagles could potentially have to make a different roster decision. Dameon Pierce has also been dealing with a hamstring injury over the last couple of weeks, but the projection still considers Barkley, Bigsby, and Shipley the 3 best options at the position. Then we get to wide receiver, and this is where things become much more complicated. The Eagles have several players competing for a limited number of spots, including Devonta Smith, Dontavian Wicks, Quez Watkins, Darius Cooper, and Hollywood Brown. Philadelphia could easily decide to keep 6 receivers, and that 6th spot could come down to Johnny Wilson or Elijah Moore. Moore is particularly interesting because of the way he has performed during the summer. The source describes him as having a really good camp and points out that he has been productive with multiple teams while bringing speed and gadget ability to the position. But there is another argument that could work in Darius Cooper's favor. The Eagles could prefer keeping the younger player rather than giving that roster spot to a veteran like Moore. Hollywood Brown has also made his case stronger with a couple of really good practices during the week and a solid performance against New England. And then there is Johnny Wilson. The projection suggests that Wilson could potentially pass through waivers and return to Philadelphia as a blocking wide receiver, especially because the Eagles missed that type of contribution last year. That is a fascinating possibility because it shows just how difficult the numbers game is becoming at wide receiver. Having talent is not necessarily enough when there are only so many roster spots available. At tight end, the projection has Dallas Goedert as the clear number 1, with Jack Stoll providing excellent blocking ability. Eli Stowers is another player who has started to make more plays and has continued to show why the Eagles are interested in his development. His blocking technique was not perfect, but there were encouraging moments, and against New England he caught 3 passes on 3 targets. The athleticism is clearly there, and his comfort catching the football is another positive sign. The offensive defensive line is another area where Philadelphia has impressive depth. The projected starters are Jordan Mailata, Landon Dickerson, Cam Jurgens, Tyler Steen, and Lane Johnson. Behind them, Mark Kelso is being developed as a potential future replacement for Johnson, and one of the things that makes him valuable is his ability to play both right and left tackle. Fred Johnson provides another swing tackle option, and having two players capable of handling that role is a luxury, but it could also create a trade possibility. If another team becomes desperate for offensive tackle help, Fred Johnson could potentially become an interesting player for Philadelphia to move. Drew Kendall and Willie Lampkin bring additional versatility because both can play center or guard. Micah Morris is also projected to make the team after showing some decent moments against Baltimore. On the other hand, Cam Williams and Miles Hinton are projected to miss the roster, with their lack of development becoming one of the more disappointing storylines of training camp. And when you move to the defensive side of the football, the Eagles' depth becomes even more impressive. At defensive tackle, Philadelphia has Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, and Moro Ojomo, a trio described in the source as potentially one of the best defensive tackle groups in the entire NFL. Because the Eagles play a 3-4 defensive structure, Ojomo and Carter can also provide flexibility by playing some defensive end. Byron Young is also projected to make the roster, with Vic Fangio clearly having confidence in him. Young's development has been an interesting story, especially considering where his career appeared to be heading after his time with the Las Vegas Raiders. The Eagles have developed him into a much more useful player, and that development is now putting him in position to secure a roster spot. Ty Robinson, however, is one of the players who may have saved himself with his performance against Baltimore. Fangio had reportedly described his roster chances as being on life support, but Robinson responded with a strong performance and recorded a sack. He did make a mistake with a late hit on the quarterback that resulted in a personal foul, but his overall performance was enough to keep him firmly in the conversation. After that Baltimore game, his recent production is carrying significant weight in the projection, although he still needs to finish the preseason strongly. Another fascinating defensive player is Ugo Amadi. The Eagles can use the IPP exemption on him, and the projection has him making the 53-man roster despite the expectation that he would not be active on game days. Against Baltimore, he played 13 snaps and showed strong hands and impressive power. He also appeared to be learning the game quickly, which makes his development especially intriguing. At linebacker, Philadelphia also has difficult decisions to make. Zach Cunningham is viewed as one of the best players at the position, while Jihad Campbell is still developing and showed flashes in the first preseason game. He was able to recognize something before the snap, although he also missed some plays that Vic Fangio discussed during the week. The upside with Campbell remains significant, while Jeremiah Trotter Jr. could be one of the most interesting players on the entire defense. He is described as a starting caliber linebacker who could either begin the season as a backup or potentially push for a starting role. Smile Mondon has also continued to show value, particularly on special teams, while Deontay Lawson has performed well throughout the preseason and strengthened his case with another solid showing against Baltimore. At cornerback, the competition is just as intense. Keyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, and Rick Woolen are part of the projected starting group, while Jonathan Jones brings veteran experience and has been dealing with a shoulder injury. Mac McWilliams has been inconsistent at times, but has otherwise had a good camp, and Kaylee Ringo's special teams value could be enough to secure his roster spot. The safety position adds another layer of versatility because Cooper DeJean can move between safety and nickel cornerback. Andrew Makuba has had a good camp, Marcus Epps has earned the trust of Vic Fangio, and Michael Carter has been one of the strongest performers on the entire 90-man roster according to the projection. Carter's versatility may be one of the biggest reasons he remains in the conversation. He can play backup slot, potentially start in the slot, and also play safety. After struggling the previous year, following his trade from the New York Jets, he has responded with much stronger football during this preseason, and that brings us to the players fighting for those final roster spots, where every decision could become critical. Rocco Underwood is the only long snapper on the 90-man roster and has been snapping the ball well. Braden Mann is viewed as one of the best punters in football, while Jake Elliott enters what could be a defining season for his future with Philadelphia. He has the opportunity to continue what has been an illustrious Eagles career, but if he struggles early and costs the team games, the organization could eventually have to consider another option. There are also some players who could surprise everyone and force their way way into the conversation, including Kevon Wallace, Maximus Poole, Cole Wooski, and Shaun Wade. Wallace and Poole, in particular, are serious candidates to potentially make the 53-man roster, although another player would have to be removed to create that opportunity. So with so many difficult decisions still ahead, which player do you think the Eagles absolutely cannot afford to leave off this 53-man roster? The reason those final roster decisions are so important is because the Eagles are not simply trying to find 53 players who can fill a depth chart. They are trying to build a roster where versatility, development, special teams value, and immediate production can all coexist. And that is exactly why some of these battles are so difficult to predict. Take the safety room, for example. Michael Carter's ability to play multiple positions gives Philadelphia another layer of flexibility that can become extremely valuable over the course of a season. A player who can step into the slot, play safety, and potentially start when needed gives the coaching staff more options without requiring another roster spot for every situation. Andrew Makuba has also put together a good camp, while Marcus Epps has the confidence of Vic Fangio. That combination makes this a position group where the final decisions may depend as much on versatility as they do on starting ability. Cooper DeJean is another major piece of that puzzle because Philadelphia can move him around. He can play safety at times and can also handle the nickel cornerback role. That means the Eagles have the ability to adjust their defensive personnel without completely changing the structure of the defense. For a team